About. All right, if I could have you guys all turn around, we're going to head into Reengineering, business process reengineering. All right, so I had you guys read an article called Reengineering Work, Don't Automate, Obliterate. Before we look at that, though, let me just talk to you guys a little bit about this idea. Back in, I think it was right around 1990. This article has a date of July, August 1990. A book came out. Reengineering the Corporation. Reengineering Corporation, I believe it's got that same year on it. Well, it says 93, so probably similar to Carr. They got the popular article, then the popular book. This one had a massive impact on business back in the 90s. Reengineering was the buzzword, the keyword of the day. And the basic idea, well, you know what, I will refer to you guys because I'd like to hear from you. What is the basic idea behind re-engineering a process? What does that term mean? Okay, but it's more than just improving. Yes, improving it is definitely the whole goal, right? You're not going to do it if you're not trying to improve it. But maybe let me just say it another way. Let's say I make, we'll do order taking because that was a good example. I take orders and I feel like we have to improve there. That's key to our business. It's inefficient. We've looked at other companies and they do it with fewer people or whatever. Need to improve it. So to re-engineer it, does that mean I look at that process and just try to figure out how to make that existing process go faster? No. Right? No. Yes. All right. All right. But how do I even go about doing that? Yeah, essentially, when you say you're re-engineering a process, you are obliterating it. That's using the term from the title. You are starting over. You're saying, all right, what do we want to accomplish? What does this process do? Well, it takes orders. Okay, good. What is that final product? Well, the final thing is that the order got to the customer. Okay. What is the input to the process? Well, the input is the order that comes in. All right, with those two givens, how do we get from one to the other? Because the problem is that most companies, what they'll do is they'll take their existing way of doing things and just tweak it a little bit. Okay, we just gained 2% improvement. Good. Or we eliminated one person from this 55-person chain that needs, that needs to happen. The idea behind re-engineering is that you actually blow up the process. You take your process, you completely get rid of it, and you reimagine it. And that's really what kind of the point of don't automate, obliterate is. That's really what this article is saying to you. He says right here in the second paragraph, second column top, speeding up the processes cannot address their fundamental performance deficiencies. That's the first thing he talks about, is you can't just take something you do and try to speed it up. You guys are going to be given a process later, in a little bit, when we get through talking about the article. I'm going to give you a process. And it's not going to be a very nice process, but it's going to be a process for creating a product. And I've got all the goodies here to help you create that product. And you're going to have to do it once just so you can see how it works. And then you're going to get to redesign the process as a team, 2 teams. You're going to get to redesign that process to try to make it faster, to try to make it better, with the same amount of resources, the same amount of people, the exact same thing as your opponents will have. And you will see who redesigns their process better. That might make it a whole lot faster. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. It's fun, and hopefully you'll get to kind of see this in action. There's 2 examples in here. One is Ford and one is Mutual Benefit Life. Does anybody remember, just at a high-level summary of what these processes were and what happened? Yeah, they realized they had 400 people processing accounts payable at Ford. Now, this is in the 80s sometime. They had 400 people. And they were going on an ambitious campaign to reduce the number of people and the time it took to process accounts payable. And their original goal was to cut 20%. So go from 500 to 400. But about that same time, Ford took an interest in Mazda. I'm not sure, I don't think they bought them, but they took a percentage of Mazda. And they looked over at Mazda and saw that Mazda had 5 people in their accounts payable department. So here's Ford, a bigger company by far, thinking they were doing a wonderful thing by going from 500 to 400 accounts payable clerks. They look over at Mazda and they go, well, how come they only have 5 to process their accounts payable? There was a fundamental difference in the way accounts payable was being processed. The bottom line was, when they finished it, and they have some diagrams in here. I'm going to do a different one up here, so I'm not going to give you this one. Was they actually now pay for it when they receive the parts instead of when they receive the invoice. And that completely changed the need for people. Because what would happen is the person receiving the product on the dock used to be that they would then say, well, we got the product. Then Ford would wait for an invoice to show up. They would match the invoice to the product. Did we get it? Yes. Okay, now we'll pay it. Well, that took someone to receive the product and somebody to process accounting, right? Accounts payable. So, again, I'm generalizing. So essentially what they said was, well, wait. When we receive the product, if we already know how much we're supposed to pay them for it, and we've already ordered it, and we already know who to send the payment to, why don't we just have the person who receives it and verifies that we got what we said, go to the computer and just say, pay, we've received it. Why go through this extra step of waiting for an invoice and so on? That's what they did. And they were able to reduce, I forget, what was the number? 80%? 75%. So they didn't get down to 5 people. But again, they're a much bigger company. And MBL, Mutual Benefit Life, was pretty much the same thing. They were processing, I think it was loans, now I can't remember. But the idea is the same, is you can't just take your existing process and just try to speed it up. You have to look at the overall picture of the entire process and then determine how can we get it done, because what has changed? There's a great sidebar in here. It's on page 110. Why did we design inefficient processes? I think this is maybe one of the best parts of the whole article, because every time I talk about business process reengineering, one of the questions always comes up is, well, why were they so stupid in the first place? Why did they create a process that was that dumb to begin with? And this little section explains it. Somebody read that? Want to summarize it for us? Well, how did these processes get created that were so bad in the first place? Yes, it's how they always did it. Okay, that's part of it. Obviously, that's not how you create a process. But when a process gets created, a lot of times it gets created just because, well, that's the most convenient way to do this. We're a small company, and the reason we process, I can't remember if it's from this or not. Yeah, here it is. I'll just read it because it's a great example. Why do we send foreign accounts to the corner desk? Because 20 years ago, Mary spoke French, and Mary had the corner desk. Mary no longer works here, and we no longer do business in France, but we still send foreign accounts to the corner desk because that's just the way we did it. It got institutionalized. It became part of the process. You'll find as companies are small and do things informally, they don't document what they do. They just do things to what makes sense. And when you're small, it can be actually pretty efficient. But as you grow, you have to train people how to do things. You have to start documenting your processes. And now it becomes, well, this is how we do things. If you get one of these, you give it to that person. Okay, and that person checks it off without asking why. Pretty soon you got a 500-person department, and that's how they do it. These processes got designed before technology is where it's at. They got designed when your company was smaller, maybe with fewer people or with fewer products. It changes quite a bit. Another example says, why does an electronics company spend $10 million a year to manage a field inventory worth $20 million? Well, because once upon a time the inventory was worth $200 million and managing it only cost $5 million. But since then, warehousing costs have escalated, components have become less expensive, and better forecasting techniques have minimized units in inventory. So things change. So you have to look at your processes, look at how you do things, and then determine the best ways to do it. What is the role of IT in reengineering? Because this is a class in technology, right, in MIS. There's a great statement in here. There's a lot of great statements in here. But I believe on page 106, top right, it talks about how databases and networks are making difference. The team realized that shared databases and computer networks could make many different kinds of information available to a single person, while expert systems could help people with limited experience make sound decisions. Huh, sounds a lot like that business process management we talked about with the guy creating my new bank account. That's exactly what they're talking about here. So the processes can now be changed. You can take advantage of the new technologies, take advantage of the fact that a computer can help people with 90% of the questions they might have. All right. So the role of IT in reengineering is really a role of support. It's a role where you don't design the process around the IT, but you use the IT to support the process. It can empower employees. All right, let me give you the example that's in this book, Reengineering the Corporation. At the very beginning of the book, they talk about a division of IBM called IBM Credit. Now, back when this was written, everybody knew that IBM was one of the world's biggest computer companies, and they sold lots of computers. Most people today, from your generation, probably don't connect the term IBM with computers very much, at least. But IBM, 60s and 70s and 80s, probably into the early 90s even, what they sold, they did have a line of PCs, which they've gotten rid of, but they sold mainframes, those big computers that cost millions of dollars. That was their bread and butter, and they were the dominant company. They had a division called IBM Credit. What IBM Credit did was offer financing to people, to companies who wanted to buy these huge mainframes. Now I've got up here a very simple diagram of the process they used to issue credit. Okay, think of it sort of like someone coming to them for a loan so they could buy the computer. And I think that's pretty important, right? Is someone says, I want to buy your $25 million mainframe, but I have to pay for it monthly. I can't, you know, my company doesn't want to put up that much upfront investment. We want to pay monthly and so on. It says here, all right, I'll read this part. Our first case concerns IBM Credit Corporation, a wholly owned subsidiary of IBM, which, if it were independent, would rank among the Fortune 100 service companies. IBM Credit is in the business of financing the computers, software, and services that IBM Corporation sells. It is a business of which IBM is fond, since financing customers' purchases is an extremely profitable business. So they make even more money, you know, than just selling the computer. They make a lot of money financing them. So here's how it worked. When an IBM field salesperson called in with a request for financing, he or she reached one of 14 people sitting around a conference room table in Old Greenwich, Connecticut. The person taking the call logged the request for a deal on a piece of paper. That was step one. Okay, so there you have customer. They call for credit. My guess is really it's the sales rep and the customer together. They call, and they get somebody sitting at a desk whose whole job is to answer the phone and take the request. Okay, I'm going to finance this kind of computer. Here's the name of my company. Okay, step two. Now remember, this is old. So this isn't, you know, today I'm not sure anyone would do it this way, but this is the way they were doing it. In step two, someone carded a piece of paper. So this person filled it in on a form, on a piece of paper. Someone took that piece of paper upstairs to the credit department. Okay, so they created this piece of paper called the call log, took it to the credit department, where a specialist entered the information into a computer system and checked the potential borrower's creditworthiness. So this person had some sort of spreadsheet or database where they could look up that company and how financially sound they were. Step three, the business practices department. Remember, it's all on a piece of paper. So what this person would do after they ran that check would be write down the credit score or whatever the appropriate information was. Then that would be sent to the next department, the legal people. Or it says in here, business practices. The business practices department was in charge of modifying the standard loan covenant in response to a customer request. So if the customer said, we want to pay over a certain number of years, customer said, we need some sort of special tax rate, we need to do it this way, or we're only going to finance a percentage of it, whatever it is, they would modify the loan agreement. So there's a standard loan agreement, but it would be up to them then to make sure that it fit with what the customer asked for and what IBM would support. They had their own computer system, so two separate computer systems. When done, a person in that department would attach the special terms to the request form. Next, the request went to the pricer. So you can see the next step down there is pricing, who keyed the data into a personal computer spreadsheet to determine the appropriate interest rate. So they would take this other information based on some models they'd set up in a spreadsheet, they would get an interest rate. The pricer wrote the rate on the piece of paper, with the other papers, that was delivered to the clerical groups, step 5 down there at the end. That person would then write up the contract, the final contract. So all these pieces of paper would be used to create the actual contract. There, an administrator turned all this information into a quote letter that could be delivered to the field sales representative by FedEx. Okay, so it would then get sent back to the customer. This entire process consumed, on average, 6 days. So it takes 6 days on average from when the customer called in till when they received their quote. Sometimes it could take as long as 2 weeks. Now, from the sales rep point of view, so say you're the IBM sales rep. So you're out there with your customer. They've agreed to this great sale, right? You get paid on commissions. This is a big deal, right? $25 million computer with probably software, services, contract for maintenance, all that gets quite expensive, gets quite lucrative as a salesperson. But they can't buy it without this credit. So guess what? You're calling after 2 days, right? Because, you know, you want to know, how's this going? Is there any problems? What can I do to help this go through? So it says, from the sales rep's point of view, this turnaround was too long since it gave the customer 6 days to find another source of funding, to be seduced by another computer vendor, or simply call the whole deal off. So the rep would call and call and call to ask, where's my deal? When are you going to get it out? Naturally, no one had a clue because the request was lost somewhere in the chain. So if he calls here, and the request is over here at step 3, nobody knows where it is. Well, you know, it went in 4 days ago and it's not here. You know, so this person would get up from their desk and walk around and try to find where it was so they could tell the sales rep, oh, it's still sitting in the, you know, the legal specialist desks. So IBM said, this is a problem, right? So they needed to improve the process. So what did they do? Well, it says in their efforts to improve the process, IBM Credit tried several things. First, they decided to install a control desk so they could answer the reps' questions about the status. So at first they thought, well, maybe if we can keep track of where everything is better, we can, one, when the sales rep calls in, we can immediately tell him or her where that deal is. And two, then we can, you know, we have good organization, we know where it is. So they actually they moved this call logger to the middle, and what would happen is after it went to each step, it would go back to the call logger who would write down where it was, and then they would send it to the next person. So now you had this kind of hub and spoke thing where it would go from one person to the next, but always back to the middle. This fix did indeed solve one problem. The control desk knew the location of each request in the labyrinth and could give the rep the information he or she wanted. Unfortunately, this information was purchased at the cost of adding even more time to the turnaround. That actually slowed it down, though they were now more accurate when someone called and said, well, where's my process? Where's my order in the process? Eventually, 2 managers had to brainstorm. Okay, so here's how we want to think when we're doing reengineering. They took the financing request and walked it themselves through all 5 steps, asking personnel in each office to put aside whatever else they were doing and to process the request as they normally would, without the delay of having it sit in a pile on someone's desk. So an order would come in and the managers said, all right, let's take this order and walk it to this person's desk and say, please process this now, and then walk it to the next person's desk, and so on, all the way through to see how long does it take to process one of these. They learned from their experiments that performing the actual work took in total 90 minutes. So what was taking up to 2 hours to get through was actually 90 minutes of work. 2 hours, sorry, 2 weeks. The remainder, which now was up to more than 7 days on average, was consumed by handing the form off from one department to the next. So sitting and waiting in people's boxes is what was taking so long. Management had begun to look at the heart of the issue, which was the overall process. Indeed, if by some wave of the magic wand the company were able to double the speed of productivity of each individual in the organization, total turnaround time would have been reduced by only 45 minutes. So just make, each of these separate individual steps faster, since the whole thing was only 90 minutes, would only save 45 minutes, which really isn't going to make a big change to that average 7 days up to 2 weeks. In other words, it was the process that had to change, not the individual steps. So, they made a change. Now, a process like this comes about Not because they're trying to design a bad process, but because when they were smaller and when requests were different, they actually found that this was the best way to do it. But what was really happening, they don't explain it yet, they're going to explain it in a minute, but I want to explain it to you, is why things got stacked up and waiting so long is if an order for a loan came in and it had a whole bunch of extra requests to it, like special details that needed to be handled, it would get processed in the order it was received. So if I had a loan come in that would require this customized loan agreement guy to take 6 hours to customize the loan agreement, any other request that came in after would have to sit and wait. And then if a different loan came in and the pricer found that it wasn't in his spreadsheet, so he had to call up a specialist, all the loans behind that, again, would be held up. So this process was designed with this idea that every loan's going to need special attention. Every loan needs detail. But it turned out that most of the loans that were coming in just needed standard pricing, standard contracts, standard quotes. That's why it only took 90 minutes. So they had to redesign this process with the idea that, wait a minute, if 90% of these things coming in are all the same, we just got to plug in a company name and the current interest rate and a couple other things, why are we going through all these steps? So here's what they did. In the end, IBM Credit replaced its specialists, the credit checkers, the pricers, and so on, with generalists. Now instead of sending an application from office to office, one person called a deal structurer processes the entire application from beginning to end, no handoff. So the sales rep would call directly to a deal structurer. That person, using a computer system to help them, to help guide them, would be able to fill out everything. In the few cases that there were exceptions, those few that took a long time before, they could hand those off or use the services of the specialist. But now we had multiple people doing this too, so there were several paths it could go. How could one generalist replace 4 specialists? The old process design was founded on a deeply held assumption that every bid request was unique and difficult to process, thereby requiring the intervention of 4 highly trained specialists. Every company has deeply held assumptions that they're not even aware of. IBM had to uncover, as they researched why this process was set up the way it was and why it was so bad by their standards, it's because there were some deeply held assumptions they had when they created the process, that every loan request was special. Now that wasn't true anymore, but it was at the time. So that's the way companies need to think. When you're redesigning process, when you think about how work gets done, start by saying, well, number one, what are we trying to accomplish, right? But 2 is, what are the assumptions that we have in place for this process, and why is it that way? Just like we send the foreign orders to the corner desk because, oh, it was because someone used to speak French over there, but they don't anymore. Why are we doing that? Same thing happens in this. All right, just real quick. The performance improvement achieved by the redesign is extraordinary. IBM Credit slashed its 7-day turnaround time to 4 hours. And that says 6 hours, so I'm not sure where that came from. This says 4 hours. It did so without an increase in headcount. In fact, it has achieved a small headcount reduction. At the same time, the number of deals that it handles has increased 100-fold. Not 100%, but 100 times. So they're able to handle 100 times the number of requests with essentially the same number of people just by changing the process. Now, obviously, that's one of the success stories, and that's why it's in the front of this book. There are also a lot of re-engineerings that didn't work. In fact, when I remember distinctly the 90s, because I was involved in several projects where we did re-engineering at a company I was at. And I was part of the team developing software to track processes. That's what I did. That was my job for several years, is developing online systems that people could go in and track how they were doing their work so it could be measured and redesigned. And then after it was redesigned, I would create the new system, and you would be able to see, are we late, are we on time, how many of these are we creating? We were making computer chips. One of the things that happened, though, is this re-engineering craze took off in the 90s, and a lot of companies said, ooh, this is a really good way for us to lay people off. We'll just say we're re-engineering something, and then we'll lay half the department off and say, well, the rest of you just have to work harder because we re-engineered. And re-engineering got a bad rap. If you read, I think, the Wikipedia entry on this and a couple others, they talk about how companies re-engineering got a bad connotation. If a company said they were going to do re-engineering, people were afraid for their jobs because they figured that that was the point, is the company wanted to figure out how to reduce employees. And in fact, one of the outcomes of re-engineering a process could be fewer people are needed to do the same amount of work. Now in the case here of IBM Credit, they did lose a few people, but they're handling 100 times the work. At least that's what it said. All right. We are ready. But before we go, does anyone have a question on business process reengineering? I would say it's a form of business process management. It's very confusing, BPR, BPM, right? There's two different terms there. Both say business process. One's management, one's reengineering. Business process management would be the overall. Okay? It's managing all the processes. It's using a system to track things. It's enforcing business rules. It's helping empowering your employees. Business process reengineering is the actual going into one process, obliterating it, blowing it up, whatever term you want to use, and recreating that particular process. So it's part of business process management. I'll try not to get too confusing. There will be an exam question probably on one of those, so you'll need to kind of remember the difference.